So good morning. This meeting will now come to order. As this hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice when you are recognized that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request so you are no longer muted. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. You will notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, it will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red, and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time of the hearing that the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, that ends our technical reminders at the beginning of the hearing, and I will go ahead and begin. So I'm very pleased to be the first to welcome everyone to the return of public witness hearings on tribal programs under the jurisdiction of the Interior and Environment Appropriations Subcommittee. Due to the ongoing pandemic, we are still not back to normal for public witness hearings. Prior to the pandemic, we were able to hold 2 days of hearings to receive testimony from individual tribes and tribal organizations. Last year, we were unable to hold any public witness hearings, but we received written testimony from tribes. While we are still not to pre-pandemic activities, I am pleased that this year we are having 2 virtual hearings, starting with today's hearing, to receive testimony from tribal organizations on national issues affecting Indian country. This testimony will inform the fiscal year 2023 annual appropriation. Our second hearing, which will take place tomorrow afternoon, will focus on regional Indian country issues. As we did last year, we also solicited written testimony from individual tribes to focus on specific tribal priorities. That testimony was received last month. A lot has happened since we last met. The world was shut down by a pandemic, resulting in over 900,000 deaths in the US alone, with devastating impacts in Indian country. While the pandemic continues with vaccines and therapies, we are truly getting back to normal. We also have a new president in the White House focusing on addressing the pandemic, dealing with climate change, and honoring the nation's treaty and trust responsibility to Native America by requesting investment in Indian country. For fiscal year 2023, President Biden proposes $2.8 billion for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, $583 million above fiscal year 2022 enacted level. This includes much needed increases of an additional $38 million for public safety and justice programs and construction projects. With over 55 million acres of land held in trust for tribes, Indian country is poised to be a major player in the clean energy industry. The fiscal year 2023 budget proposes an additional $104 million for natural resources management programs to continue investments to address climate change and help Indian country lead the way as we pivot to cleaner energy. Further, the budget proposes to reclassify contract support costs and payments for tribal leases as mandatory. For the Bureau of Indian Education, the president requests $4.5 billion, which is $294 million above the fiscal year 2022 enacted level. The president proposes to make substantial investment in education construction with a requested increase of $156 million. The pandemic showcased the failures of current BIE education facilities. I recently met with leaders from the National Indian Education Association, where we discussed the need for additional infrastructure investment. This requested increase will go towards addressing these needs. For the Indian Health Service, the president proposes to reclassify the entire budget as mandatory. This proposal is not within the subcommittee's jurisdiction. Although no discretionary funds were requested, I look forward to today's testimony on priority areas for Indian health. I am pleased to welcome back national tribal organizations to discuss the needs and challenges facing Indian country. I'm eager to learn more about Native Americans' national priorities, and I look forward to our discussions on these issues because I believe it will help to inform us as we begin to develop the 2023 Appropriations Bill. Each witness's full written statement will be introduced into the record, so please do not feel pressured to cover everything orally. After we hear the testimony of each witness on the panel, members will have an opportunity to ask questions. And with that, I'm happy to yield to my friend, Mr. Joyce, for his remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you for continuing these important hearings to get input from our tribal leaders on a wide array of programs under the subcommittee's jurisdiction. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to the distinguished tribal leaders testifying today. All of you have the difficult job of representing a diverse array of interests from hundreds of sovereign nations across the country. I represent the northeast corner of Ohio, which was once the land of Miami, Seneca, and others. I'm humbled to be joining you in my capacity as ranking member on the House Appropriations Subcommittee. And perhaps it's needed now more than ever, with Indian country recently losing a true leader on Capitol Hill with the passing of Congressman Don Young. Though not an official member of the subcommittee, he always looked forward to these annual tribal hearings and would occasionally join us at the hearing table. We will miss him, and as likely he would have wanted, we will endeavor to carry on his work on behalf of all American Indians and Alaska Natives. Like Don Young and many others in Congress, I recognize that upholding the tribal trust obligation is a responsibility shared by all members of Congress, regardless of congressional district. I also fully recognize that the federal government has a long way to go before fully meeting its trust and treaty obligations. That's why my position on the Appropriations Committee is a great honor, but it's also a heavy responsibility. Fortunately, I have a friend and partner in Chairwoman Pingree, and it's my sincere hope that together we will continue the hard work of our predecessors for more than a decade to increase the federal commitment to meeting those trust and treaty obligations. So I look forward to listening and learning from the testimony today and working with my chair and the rest of my colleagues in the days and weeks ahead to do what we can to help in the next fiscal year. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce, and thank you so much for remembering our colleague Don Young. He truly was a champion of Indian country, and we will miss him, absolutely. Do any other members wish to make an opening statement? Okay, if not, we'll turn to our witnesses. So we will begin with Ms. Fawn Sharp, President of the National Congress of American Indians. Thank you for joining us today. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah, good morning, Chairwoman Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the House Subcommittee. I am Fawn Sharp, Vice President of the Quinault Indian Nation and President of the National Congress of American Indians. Thank you for the invitation to testify this morning. This subcommittee's jurisdiction includes some of the most critical funding for Indian country. As detailed in the 2018 Broken Promises Report, chronically underfunded and inefficiently structured federal programs have left some of the most basic obligations of the United States to tribal nations unmet for centuries. We call on this subcommittee and Congress to get behind the vision of tribal leaders for righting these wrongs by providing mandatory, full, and adequate funding for Indian country. The President's fiscal year 23 budget request is a historic shift in the paradigm of nation-to-nation relationships, one that seeks to restore the promises made to our ancestors. It includes requesting mandatory funding for Indian Health Service, contract support costs, and Section 105L leases. Providing mandatory funding to these programs promotes the opportunity for a tribal nation-driven approach to serving our communities and citizens. Under the current discretionary spending model at IHS, the per patient investment is about 56% less than the national health spending per capita. At an average age of 37 years old, IHS hospitals are nearly 4 times the age of hospital facilities nationwide. It would take nearly 400 years to replace and update these facilities with the funding currently provided. We see the same staggering issues for education. The weighted student unit for the Bureau of Indian Education School System is approximately half that of public schools. Further, DOI recently rated 86 schools in poor condition, with an estimated cost of $5.1 billion for replacement. Last month, the NCAI board toured the Casablanca Community School, a BIE school built by the Gila River Indian community using the Section 105 lease program. This state-of-the-art school was built in a record time with input from the entire community. As soon as the children step off the bus, they are grounded and surrounded by their culture, their language, and their stories in a fully inclusive educational environment. Mandatory funding for the 105L lease program means empowering tribal nations to build the bright future we all see for Indian country. Turning to law and justice, the safety of our communities is in crisis and of the utmost importance. The 2019 Tribal Law and Order Act report to Congress estimates the need for BIA public safety and justice programs at $2.73 billion, 5 times the amount of funding provided in 2022. With tribal nations' criminal jurisdiction being further restored in the recent reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and beyond, Indian country must be provided the necessary funding to protect our communities. Finally, with a long history of federal Indian policies, many tribal lands have been placed in the hands of the federal government with a trust responsibility to conserve and protect them. However, tribal nations' voices have been heard, and we are now assuming greater roles of stewardship and co-management of public lands. These opportunities demonstrate creative management solutions through tribal federal partnerships. This subcommittee must continue to increase resources provided for tribal co-management of federal land. It is essential for tribal nations to bring our solutions, our traditional ecological knowledge to the table with federal partners to combat the climate change crisis. From what we have seen over the last few years and what we've known all along, when tribal nations are provided the parity and deference to provide programs and services, we see substantial positive changes within our communities. NCAI urges this subcommittee to work with the budget committee to fund mandatory obligations through mandatory federal spending and provide funding for programs commensurate to those obligations and not just the status quo. Tribal nations are resilient, and we have demonstrated our resolve and dedication since time immemorial. We expect to continue to be treated as sovereign nations and with governmental parity and equity. When we work together, we have proven we can achieve more than we thought possible. We must now continue down the path of nation-to-nation growth, and only then will all of our people truly be able to flourish. Siakul, thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Next, we'll hear from Mr. Jason Dropik, President of the National Indian Education Association. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Chair Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee, Miigwech, thank you for this opportunity to provide testimony on behalf of the National Indian Education Association. Minogigajep, Babami Benes Indigenous, Minawaki and Dunjaba, Migizi and Dudem, Anishinaabe and Dao. Good morning. My name is Babami Benes, Jason Dropik, serving as president of the National Indian Education Association, but I get the unique opportunity to also serve as head of school at the Indian Community School in Franklin, Wisconsin, right outside of Milwaukee, serving Indigenous youth and getting to see the impact of what a cultural-based education can do for students and their futures. NIEA is the most inclusive national Native organization advocating for culture-based educational opportunities for American Indians, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians. Each day, our organization equips tribal leaders, educators, and advocates to prepare the over 700,000 Native students across the nation for success in the classroom and beyond. Native education is a bipartisan effort rooted in the federal trust responsibility to tribal nations and their citizens. NIE thanks the subcommittee for its ongoing commitment to fulfilling this constitutional responsibility by advancing Native education programs and services in the fiscal year 2023. In particular, we appreciate the subcommittee's oversight of Bureau of Indian Education programs and services to Native students. Since the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic, the national education landscape has shifted dramatically. The spread of COVID-19 throughout tribal communities shined a spotlight and exacerbated existing educational inequities for Native students. Tribal nations acted quickly to save lives and continue educating our youth, often without the structures, resources, and means to do so. Fully funding Native education within the Bureau of Indian Education in fiscal year 2023 is essential to ensuring that Native students have access to resources to recover and thrive after the pandemic and into their futures. Fiscal year 2023 recommendations we have: As the subcommittee considers funding levels for the coming fiscal year, NIA urges Congress to consider the full scope of need for education programs in the Department of Interior through the Bureau of Indian Education and Bureau of Indian Affairs. Congress must continue to invest in and oversee education programs central to the cultural and academic progress of Native students. Such measures are critical to ensure that Native students have access to these resources. Those resources are necessary for their survival. From competitive salaries for highly effective, culturally competent educators, through the Indian Schools Equalization Program, to the infrastructure of a modern classroom, to Native language and culture-based programs, federal appropriations are vital to ensuring equity for the only students to which the federal government has a direct responsibility, Native students. At this time, I would like to highlight just several of NIA's key appropriation priorities for fiscal year 2023. Bureau-funded schools must be appropriated at least $440 million for urgent school construction and repair. NIA appreciates recent steps to address immediate infrastructure, especially in light of more than 2-year pandemic. However, funding continues to fall far short of the total need. In 2016, the Office of the Inspector General at the Department of Interior found that it would cost $430 million to address immediate facility repairs in BIE. Those are immediate repairs. Our request is modest when taking into account inflation since 2016. The President's budget request for fiscal year 2023 is only $420 million, far short of what is critically needed. The Indian School Equalization Program, ISEP, should be fully funded at $500.7 million for fiscal year 2023, per the fiscal year 2023 presidential budget request. ISEP funds the core budget account for BIE elementary and secondary schools. Through this program, schools receive funding to pay teachers and other personnel salaries. While ISEP is funded at approximately $2 million per school, each public school across the country receives on average $6 million for salaries, wages, and employee benefits. Each year, schools are forced to stretch limited ISEP funds further to fulfill regulations that require educators to be paid salaries comparable to those at only the federal school system. The Department of Defense education activity. This requirement is meant to support parity in access. However, federal appropriations have failed to account for increases in competitive salaries at DODEA, and in states where BIE schools are located, increased investment is required to ensure access to highly qualified, culturally competent educators at all schools. When funding is cut in other areas of the BIE budget, ISEP funds are often used to make up the difference. A flood, broken heater, or leaky roof can force a BIE school to lay off a special education teacher, a student counselor, or school security officer halfway through the school year. Congress must ensure that ISEP is allocated adequate funding to fulfill all program needs. In conclusion, healthy education systems are vital to thriving tribal nations and communities. Though tribal leaders and legislators juggle several priorities, education cannot be forgotten. Appropriations have the potential to promote equity and ensure access to excellent education options, which prepare Native students to thrive in the classroom and beyond. NIA urges Congress to uphold the federal trust responsibility for all Native students by fully funding critical programs that support effective and culturally appropriate Native education. Our students, including the students in Bureau-funded schools, deserve nothing less. Miigwech, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Next, we'll hear from Mr. William Smith, the president of the National Indian Health Board. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Good morning, Madam Chair, President, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the 574 federally recognized tribal nations and members organizations that the National Indian Health Board serves, thank you for this opportunity to testify for the fiscal year 2023 fund for the Indian Health Service. My name is William Smith. I am the chairman and the Alaska area representative of the National Health Board. As a Vietnam War veteran and a retired Army sergeant, I am proud to have served my country and to continue the public service by serving the tribal nations through the National Indian Health Board. For the fiscal year 2023 and beyond, robust investments are necessary to fulfill the federally trust responsibilities and treaty obligations and improve the health of all Alaska Natives and American Indians. This funding must also empower tribes to prevent and prepare for public health emergencies. To that end, we are pleased that the President's fiscal year 2023 budget requests support mandatory funding for the IHS at $9.1 billion. which increases over the following 10 years. It is a bold vision and an end to a chronic funding inadequacy and building a comprehensive Indian health care system. We urge Congress to support the request and work together with administrations and the tribes to see that it's passed into law. My written testimony discusses this proposal and other key priorities in more detail. Today, I want to focus on mental and behavioral health facilities and finally full funding. In his December 2021 advisory, the U.S. Surgeon General found that Native youths were at higher risk for mental and behavioral health challenges during the pandemic. While advisory found on youth, these findings could also apply to our adults and other health challenges. Before the pandemic, tribal communities were already at a behavioral health crisis, according to the National Center for Health Statistics. American Indians and Alaska Native women experienced a higher increase in suicide rate from 139% from 1999 to 2017. The men between the ages of 15 and 44 experienced the highest rate of suicide of all races and ethnic groups. The overall death of the adults from suicide is about 20% higher compared to the non-Hispanic white populations. Suicide has skyrocketed for Native veterans from 19.1 to 47 in 100,000 people. But most shocking, for those ages 18 to 39, it was 66 in 100,000 persons. The pandemic devastated our communities. It highlighted the consequences of chronic underfunding. For example, according to the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, 13% of the Native populations needs substance abuse treatment, but only 3.5% receives any treatment. Congress must tackle these issues head on with aggressive funding for prevention and treatment measures for tribes. Facilities is also necessary to make the impact on these problems. In 2010, Congress authorization the construction of inpatient behavioral health and other specified facilities such as long care, term, and dialysis. While suicide, other health problems, and cost construction has yet to be funded. In fact, Congress has not funded a complete series of health care facilities still on the 1993 waiting list. The Indian Health Service has indicated that facility construction cost alone is now up to $22 billion. Yet Congress funded the entire Indian Health Service system at $6.6 billion for fiscal year 2023. As the result, tribal leaders and health policy experts determined that full funding for the IHS is at $49.8 billion is requested to make a difference. This figure takes into account medical and non-medical inflation, complications with the costly federally mandates and other emergent needs. It also a more accurate per user benchmark based on the national health experience. Achieving full funding will be difficult given the restriction spending cap in the subcommittee's allotments. But aggressive solutions are needed to make a difference. The president appears willing to move the bar. Indian country challenged Congresses to also make a difference and move in the right direction. National Indian Health Board and the tribal nations stand ready to join in this fight to health care of American Indians and Alaska Natives. Awa'ata, and thank you very much for listening to us, and I will respond to any questions.
Thank you so much for being with us today. And our fourth witness will be Ms. Sonia Tetnowski, the president-elect of the National Council of Urban Indian Health. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Good morning. My name is Sonia Tetnowski, a Makah tribal member, and I currently serve as the president-elect of the National Council of Urban Indian Health, which represents 41 urban Indian health care organizations across the nation who provide high quality, culturally competent care. I'm also the CEO of the Indian Health Center of Santa Clara Valley, a UIO that provides comprehensive health care to over 22,000 patients. Let me start by saying thank you to Chairwoman Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today. I testify today to request the tribal work group's recommended amounts of $50 billion for IHS and $950 million for urban Indian health for fiscal year 2023, supporting the president's proposal for mandatory funding for IHS, as well as advanced appropriations for IHS. We also ask that UIOs are protected from unrelated budgetary disputes and have access to the available opioid funding. UIOs provide a range of services and are primarily funded by a single line item in the annual Indian Health budget, which is only 1% of the annual budget for fiscal year 2022 for the over 70% Native people living in urban areas. Despite historically low levels of funding, UIOs have continuously provided services in the hardest hit urban areas throughout this health crisis. In fact, the county where my UIO is located was the first in the country to initiate shelter-in-place measures, as we were considered a hotspot by the CDC. I'm proud to say that IHC-SCV has been fighting diligently from day one of this pandemic to do whatever it could to protect the community. Our UIOs have played a critical role in Natives having some of the highest vaccination rates in the US. However, in order to match the pace of other clinics, we need a consistent baseline of funding, as costs for providing care continues to increase with the growing shortage of healthcare providers. As Native people had some of the highest infection rates, increased funding is needed to address the long-term impacts that COVID has had on our members. I share these insights to highlight the need for continued increases in Indian health funding and stress the importance of honoring the trust responsibility. Federal trust obligation to provide health care to Natives is not optional and must be provided no matter where they reside. Continuing to fund IHS at its current pace is what has led to irreparable health disparities, which is why we are fighting for full funding. Funding for Indian health must be significantly increased if the federal government is to finally and faithfully fulfill its trust responsibility. We want to thank the committee for the report language to allow us to finally use our 1% line item for facilities. Your report was instrumental in its final inclusion in the bipartisan infrastructure package. However, because UIOs do not receive designated facilities funding, unlike the rest of the IHS system, it is critical that the committee increase the funding for the urban Indian health line item. Additionally, any authorizing language that is specified for tribal organizations does not include urban Indian organizations. So we ask that the urban Indian organization be included in all future legislation so that we can work together to close the health equity gap that exists today. We urge you to please reach out to IHS and NCUI to ensure funding designated to help Native communities has the proper language to ensure we are included. Another priority is advanced appropriations, which for IHS is a long overdue request from tribal and urban leaders alike. Advanced appropriations is imperative to provide certainty to the Indian healthcare delivery system until such time that all trust and treaty obligations to all AIAN are accounted for and provided as mandatory spending. Again, the risk is too great and the price is too high to continue funding the way that it is now. I urge the subcommittee to consider these requests and prioritize urban Indian health, thereby enabling UIOs to continue providing high quality, culturally competent care to Native people, regardless of where they live. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I have provided written testimony to the committee and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you all for your presentations and your very thorough written testimony. We really appreciate your taking the time to be with us today. We'll now begin the questions. I'll start with a couple of questions from myself. Let's see. So I'm going to start with National Indian Education Association, Mr. Dropnik. I want to talk a little bit more about the construction, and I really appreciate your reminding us of the importance of expanding those construction funds and how far behind we are. Certainly during the pandemic, we were reminded of how inadequate the facilities are everywhere. A few years ago, the Bureau of Indian Education developed a new methodology for determining school replacement and repair needs and priority. While this new methodology seems promising, GAO and some tribal schools have questioned the accuracy of the data used to determine the needs and priority. So is your organization engaged with BIE to ensure adequate funding and training to provide technical assistance to schools to ensure the data is input accurately and timely?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. That's a great observation. I would just make 2 points. One is that NIA is always standing ready to help support whenever we are asked or called upon or invited to the table, so to speak. We would love that opportunity to share more. I would say that often sometimes those decisions seem to be made in isolation, not always with consultation, not only with NIA or even BIE at times, but also tribal communities that they serve. We really feel that that communication has to improve. It does not take place in the way that it should. The other just real quick point is that also, funding in terms of structures isn't just a BIE issue. Our structures and functions in public schools and the gap that we see with over 93% of our Native students attending public schools, those gaps are huge and continue to further separate. And so though we specifically make those asks as it relates to BIE funding, obviously from oversight perspectives, there is much need to be done on infrastructure and resources across all schools where students are. And lifting up those Native, predominantly Native schools lifts up all students in those communities. So it's really should be a win for all communities.
Yeah, thank you for your answers and also for reminding us that all of our public schools need upgrading. Coming from New England, where so many of our school buildings are old, we are acutely aware of that issue. Ms. Sharp, I wanted to just ask you a quick question about climate change. So we all know that Indian tribes are facing the enormous challenge of confronting the threat of climate change and the impacts on air, water, land, communities, human health, species, and habitat. So the FY 2023 President's budget includes an additional $29 million over the 2022 enacted level for climate adaptation and tribal relocation. Could you describe to me some of the challenges that tribes are experiencing and how climate resilience funds would be used to adapt to climate change?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you. I really appreciate that. We are on the front lines of climate change. Recently convened an NCI board meeting, and we go through what's going on in Indian country, and every region reported climate-related impacts. So all of Indian country is directly impacted, and I could speak specifically to my tribe. We're currently under 4 states of emergency. We face a massive king tide. A landslide threatens to take out the only access road to our village. And so we really appreciate any funding and attention. And the dollars that we would use would not only help relocate our villages, but we're also facing the collapse of our fisheries in the Pacific Northwest. These are issues that are key and central to our identity as Native people. And the visuals from last summer when we had temperatures of 111 degrees, there's video footage of salmon being cooked alive in the Columbia River, heat lesions and clam resources when the tide went out were just baked in the open sand. So we are on the front lines, we are threatened, and these dollars will be able to help fuel and fund our ability to adapt and mitigate these direct impacts of climate change. I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I think since there's 8 million specifically for tribal relocation, and you graphically described how it impacts your tribe, I think we have to, dig in deeper onto that and understand the number of tribes that need that level of assistance and really just how big the impact is going to be over the coming years. I've used up most of my time, but I'll get a chance again later to ask some more of your questions. So I will yield back and then see if Mr. Joyce has some questions he'd like to ask.
Once I figure out how to get back on this. Thank you. And I continue to follow up with Ms. Sharp, if you don't mind. President Sharp, of all the proposals in the president's budget that touch on this subcommittee's jurisdiction, is it fair to say that the mandatory funding for IHS is the most consequential?
I would say yes. Coming out of a global pandemic, the Broken Promises report detailed the level of funding. There's a data point in that report that says per capita, the average investment through IHS for individual tribal citizens is just over $2,000. The national average is over $9,000. That chronic underfunding is what led to our vulnerability. And so coming out of the pandemic, it's absolutely essential that we have mandatory resources as we plan to not only recalibrate the mental health crisis that's not even known at this point, but we know it's there. It's absolutely essential that we can have funding that we can rely on. That's mandatory for planning purposes and to redefine a healthcare system that's responsive to our citizens.
The mandatory funding proposals for the IHS contract support costs and 105L payments for tribal leases technically fall under the jurisdiction of the House Natural Resource Committee and not the Appropriations Committee. What is the NCAI doing to help move these proposals through the authorizing committees?
Yes, we are working diligently as a Congress, but we're also working through our regional organizations that you're going to hear from tomorrow. So we know that we have to hold the United States accountable to its trust responsibility, and that, as I pointed out in my testimony, these are chronic, longstanding, underfunded programs. And so we have to work at every level with every region and do the fact finding that we've been doing for nearly half a century at NCAI, and be able to provide that technical support to our regions, to our individual tribes, so that we can aggressively work to insist that these are mandatory. These should not be discretionary dollars. Our basic health should be a mandatory expenditure of the United States government.
Great. Well, Madam Chair, I know we have some other members on there. I'll stick around with you for round two and let them get in the questions that they may have.
Great. Thank you so much. I think the next member up is Mr. Kilmer.
Thanks, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being with us. I wanted to start by directing a couple questions to my friend, President Sharp, who's been just such an extraordinary leader in our neck of the woods and nationally with the National Congress of American Indians. You know, the chairwoman in her question touched on the impact of climate change, the impact of rising sea levels, and you already spoke eloquently about what that has meant for the Quinault Nation. You know, you've seen, if anyone goes online and Googles Tohola, which is their lower village, and flooding, you can actually see a photograph of someone rowing a canoe through the streets of their village, because we've seen storm surges and flooding. You know, unfortunately, in the district I represent, we have 4 coastal tribes that are in the process of trying to move to higher ground. In the omnibus bill, there was some funding for the Hoh tribe and the Quileute tribe and the Quinault Nation to support some of that relocation process. We're working on some other stuff. The Natural Resources Committee favorably reported out the Tribal Coastal Resiliency Act, which they introduced to try to provide some dedicated resources to coastal tribes to support their efforts to mitigate threats caused by climate change. But I think it is worth just pointing out that these are significant costs. I mean, we're literally talking about trying to relocate, in some instances, entire communities. You know, if you go out and visit the Quileute tribe, their school, any one of us could stand at the doorstep of their current school and throw a rock and land it in the Pacific Ocean right now. And, you know, if you think about the threat of tsunami, that's horrifying. And, you know, so building a school is not a cheap ticket. And then you multiply that by all of the communities that are undertaking this. So President Sharp, I was hoping you could say a bit more about how BIA and any other funding advancing climate resiliency would help in these relocation efforts, and what you think Congress ought to do on this front, because my sense is both the need is far more significant than the funding has been.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. When we did look at the budget that was released, the infrastructure bill, for example, there's $150 million for relocation for tribal nations. Our one project at Quinault is about $180 million. So the national appropriation for relocating tribal villages that's targeted for tribal nations, my one nation would consume that entire budget. So the need is tremendous. And if we consider the report that was released just yesterday by the United Nations, our reality today is only going to intensify. The climate crisis with respect to sea level rise, mega fires. And so the public treasury right now, from our perspective, is paying for the mere symptoms of climate change. We're not even getting to the concrete, the infrastructure to actually move these villages to higher ground. We're not getting to adaptation and mitigation strategies. So my recommendation going forward would be to make targeted investments to make a difference, but also to recognize the scale of this crisis is beyond the public treasury. We have to be creative in public-private partnerships with the private sector, and also with philanthropy. There's a global community waiting to enlist resources and deploy those to tribal nations. And I think the United States could be a tremendous partner and ally with tribal nations. In other parts of the world, Indigenous peoples don't have political structure. We do. And so I think there's an opportunity to meet the needs here domestically, but also to be a leader globally on these issues with respect to Indigenous peoples.
I'm going to try to squeeze in the minute I have. You mentioned the Broken Promises report, which really details, as you pointed out, chronic underfunding in infrastructure and housing and education and healthcare and economic development for tribes. And in many cases, failing to fully recognize the sovereign status of tribal governments. I'm working with Senator Warren on some legislation to address some of the recommendations outlined in that report. But President Sharp, can you just comment on the importance of actually taking action in response to the Broken Promises report?
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate that question. I'll try to answer it in 20 seconds. It is critically important that we consider this as a foundational document. There's a lot of fact finding. It determines not one federal agency is living up to its trust responsibility. So we need a partner. To the extent Congress cannot fully fund these services, you need to get behind our vision and building our economy, including tax parity and our resources to, as sovereign nations, raise the revenue and advance profitability of our enterprises. Sioko, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Very well done. Thank you. Mr. Simpson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you all for being here to testify today. Obviously, Indian health and
We lost you for a minute. I think maybe you got muted.
can you hear me now?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we're back again. But anyway, thank you all for being here today. Indian issues in Indian country has always been a bipartisan issue on this committee. We've worked together and tried to do the best we can. I noticed almost all of you recommended that we do mandatory funding for Indian health services. It was also mentioned that we do advanced appropriations. Now, if you had mandatory funding, do you need advanced appropriation? I guess I'll ask whoever wants to answer that.
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Yes, both are critically important. Mandatory means the United States is signaling to tribal nations treaty obligations and the trust responsibility is non-negotiable. That's right. Mandatory. Advanced appropriations is also vitally important to tribal nations so that we can plan. It's hard to plan for things when we don't know, when there's such a level of uncertainty all across Indian country, and specifically to the health sector. When you look at every single metric of public health for tribal nations, our citizens are off the chart. So we need these resources and we need them in advance so that we could plan effectively.
Well, I appreciate what you're saying, and I agree with you that Indian Health Service has been underfunded for years, and we've tried to increase it and so forth. But if it was mandatory, you'd pretty much know what it's going to be the next year. So, I mean, it seems to me like, maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but maybe it seems to me like if it was mandatory, you'd have that certainty rather than through the advanced appropriation. But that's a discussion we can have later on, how best to do that, because I understand where you're coming from. And I agree with you. Let me ask you, if mandatory funding were in place today, say it had been passed a couple years ago, would the 9.1 what is it, the 9.1 billion in mandatory funding for IHS be sufficient to cover those costs today, or would that level be higher today?
Yes, it wouldn't be sufficient. As I pointed out in my one of the previous questions, the disparity is so wide, the gap is so significant. It's going to take us years just to get to a basic level of healthcare. And when you look at our healthcare delivery systems in IHS, we have the resources to fund doctors, pharmacists, but do we have a comprehensive healthcare system that includes oversight, that includes quality of care, that includes access to care? A lot of these basic features of a comprehensive public healthcare system does not exist in Indian country. So for us to achieve a basic level of parity with citizens in the United States, we need far more than what is currently appropriated.
I understand what you're saying. Believe me, Representative Cole has made me aware of this over the years and the need to increase funding for Indian Health Services. It seems like if the authorizing committee passed mandatory funding, that the idea behind that is it brings that level up to where it ought to be because it's mandatory, and it does it right away. In this, from what I understand in this proposal, it's 9.1 billion in mandatory funding that will increase based on healthcare costs and population growth to 36.7 billion by 2032. Does that I'm trying to figure out mandatory at what level, and how do we anticipate those costs? And the reason I ask this question is, as you know, about a little over 70% of the federal budget is mandatory funding. Every agency in the world would love to have mandatory funding and not have to deal with the Appropriations Committee. Believe me, I fully understand that. And it might be the only way we can get Indian Health up to where it ought to be and the funding for where it ought to be. And I don't have a problem with that if that's what's necessary in order to get it to that level. And I guess I've been trying to figure out at what level would it jump right away, and how soon would we be at full funding under mandatory funding?
Yes, I really appreciate where you're going with that question, Congressman. I really appreciate thinking about not only meeting the immediate need, but the long term, and how do we get to a level of parity. And I would welcome, and as I'm sure all of our partners and colleagues who do some significant fact finding, we are coming up to an era of understanding the boarding school deaths within our community and the murder of our children. There's significant mental health crises facing Indian country. At this point, we don't even have the resources to fully understand the scale of the healthcare crises facing Indian country. And to answer your question, we should spend the time in partnership with Congress to really delve in to understand the significant right now health impacts to Indian country, and then from there build out. So I really appreciate the question. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer, and I'm more than willing, and I know members of this committee are also, to figure out how we get to the level that we ought to be at so that there's not disparity between Indian Health Services and other health services delivered by the federal government and stuff. And we, as you said, we have a treaty responsibility with these tribes, one that I'm painfully aware of, that's necessary that we try and meet. One other question, I can't see a clock, Chairwoman, so this is a briefer question.
Go ahead, sure.
And when it comes to Indian education, and it's broader than just that, one of the problems that, as I talked to like the Chauvin tribe in Idaho, they have some difficulties hiring teachers. And it's not just teachers, but it's also law enforcement officers. We just had an earmark for a $7 million fire station in Fort Hall because they needed a fire station. The one thing they told me is they have a hard time keeping the firemen on the job. They got like 20 or 30 firemen, but they are the training ground for the communities around that can pay these people much more. So in Indian education, law enforcement, other first responders, they do all the education. As soon as they get educated, a lot of them will move to other communities. How do we create a situation where they can pay these people to stay on the jobs that they've been trained for on the reservation?
You can go ahead, President Sharp, if you'd like. Otherwise, yeah, I can either way.
Yes, I could address law enforcement if you want to address education. With respect to law enforcement, you see that all across Indian country. The one suggestion I would make as we try to achieve parity with state and local government, we need parity not only in the number of officers, but in pay scales. And I've often thought, would it be nice to take the federal pay scale and include those in our self-governance compacts? We have our fish hatchery. Somebody who's been there for 30 years, and they're still not at a level that's even at the lower end of the federal scale. When someone from college comes right out to our federal hatchery, they're making about $30,000 more. And you're right, you could go to every sector. And so if we could achieve parity, take federal pay scales, plug those in, we would be able to see a sustained effort to be able to deliver public health, safety, education, welfare for all of our workforce. It's so important.
And just following up on that on education, you're absolutely right. And education and having teachers in the classroom isn't going to be an issue that is solely in Native communities, but it definitely is going to be, once again, a huge spotlight and exacerbated by when you have poor conditions, you have people wearing multiple hats because of funding deficits that create the need for people to serve in many different roles, as opposed to in their other community peers where they don't have to serve in 3 to 4 different roles in their communities. Those are some of the challenges that come in. So, there's many different ways that you can help to support that, and both of that through funding, obviously those core structures, which helps to create opportunities then for personnel where the huge gaps that we talked about in our testimony that exist between personnel deficits, but then also we can get creative. There's programming, and it might not be specific from appropriations, but really being able to pass some meaningful ways in which tribal members can be able to get their degrees without a huge burden of debt over their head as they go into their communities and they work in a payback. I graduated from a federal program that created urban American Indian teachers, and I was able to get part of my schooling paid for to serve in urban American Indian settings. And those programs are so few and far between and poorly funded that they just definitely would help provide some impact into our tribal communities. But it's structural, it's personnel, it's creating those, and it does start with funding, as well as creating those conditions for people to stay.
Thank you for that. And let's work on that. I'm more than willing to work with you. Thank you, Chairwoman Pingree.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Simpson. I let you go a little bit over, but you got the rest of Mr. Joyce's time. So I'll make it up to everybody else. Representative Lee, you are next.
Thank you, Chair Pingree and Ranking Member Joyce and all the panelists for being here today. I represent Nevada, and over 80% of our land is federally controlled, which means that tribal collaboration and participation in federal lands management is such an important issue in my state. I personally have been pleased to see the Biden administration's commitments on this front with the Tribal Homelands Initiative and Secretary Holland's new Tribal Advisory Committee. Those are all a great start, but as we saw from or heard from testimony today, much more work remains. I have a pair of questions for Ms. Sharp on this front. President Sharp, my district is home to Appropriation, which is the Mojave name for Spirit Mountain, the center of creation for 10 human-speaking tribes. Right now, a coalition of tribes, the local communities, the Nevada legislature, conservation groups, recreation interests, and others are working to establish Spirit Mountain in the area that surrounds it as a national monument. And earlier this year, I sent the secretary a letter supporting such a move. You spoke in your testimony about creative management solutions to the tribal federal partnerships when it comes to federal land management. We already know that there's 4 sites in the National Park Service, as well as 80 additional formalized relationships. From your perspective, are there successful models of formal federal and tribal cooperation that could be or should be considered when creating a new monument such as the Appropriation?
Yes, absolutely. And before I answer that specific question, I think it's important just to point out that while tribal nations ceded millions of acres of lands across this country through treaty, we've never relinquished our spiritual connection to this landscape. And that's what we bring to the table. When we bring our co-management, we bring our perspective, we bring our teachings, we bring our songs and ceremonies that remain, that have been there since time immemorial. So yes, there are examples all across Indian country where we are able to not only be at the table, but to bring that wealth, that brain trust, and that heart and that spiritual connection to the landscape. And you'll find in those instances, the management is just, it's just better. It's an added layer that connects present day management to the beginning of time and our vision to the end of time, because we do manage for 7 generations. So we bring that very broad perspective. I really appreciate that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any specific characteristics that you would believe would be essential to ensuring a productive co-leadership of tribal lands?
Yes, one of the key features I would strongly advance is the ability in co-management for tribal nations to have a decisive say over our land, territories, resources, and people, to have what is known as a universal international standard of free, prior, and informed consent. When we have the ability to have decisive say over our lands, territories, and resources without another sovereign taking unilateral action, that's when you're going to find that the relationship between tribal nations and the United States is not only respected, but advanced in a way that's honorable and that's worthy of things that are in the future that we can achieve together in a good, positive way.
Thank you. You know, I did want to comment about your previous answer. I had the pleasure of touring Spirit Mountain with the local Fort Mojave tribe and witnessing their dance and their ceremony, and it was really quite moving. So, you know, the Biden administration has the Tribal Homelands Initiative, and this is a historic commitment to upholding and enhancing the federal government's partnership and nation-to-nation relationship. As this effort continues to get underway, what elements should Congress prioritize in the near term that will best position this initiative for success in the long term?
Yes, I think a lot of the issues that we've touched on have been related to funding, to co-management, to having a decisive say. I think it's important to spend time to really understand the tribal nation's perspective. I think in oftentimes when there are new initiatives and innovative ideas, a lot of people think they have an idea of what would work for us or what is best for us. And that's been the long story of federal tribal relations. But to the extent there's some early engagement to really understand issues from our perspective, that little investment of time is going to be proved to be valuable for years to come.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Sharp, for that insight. And with that, I yield.
Thank you very much. Mr. Amadei, are you interested in asking questions? I'm not sure if I see you on there. Okay, I don't hear back from Mr. Amadei. If he wants to ask questions later, we'll put him back in the line. So we'll go to Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for our distinguished panel for testifying today. I want to talk about broadband internet. We're all talking a lot about that, but we have to talk about it in context with this hearing. Ms. Sharp, I want to start with you. In January, one of your NCAI colleagues, Mr. Rantanen, told the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs that half of the tribes did not apply for broadband funding, in part because they were unaware of the funding opportunity due to the lack of connectivity. In other words, they weren't online, so they didn't get the notice. Well, as we begin to build out better broadband access with the IIJA funds, how do we ensure that these tribes and communities who clearly need the funding are aware of the opportunities available to them?
Yes, thank you. And I'm just looking at my screen here. I don't know if my face is coming off as red as it looks on my screen, or if
you look good.
If my blood is literally boiling, I'm not sure. But to answer your question, the one thing that I would recommend for us to really put our broadband programs together, we have to go to multiple sources. If we could create a one-stop place so that we aren't band-aiding the approach to establish broadband, and then also deploy resources to help build capacity. Another reason so many tribes didn't apply, we don't even have the capacity to be able to begin the planning process. And so early dollars for planning, one-stop shopping to be able to combine all of the federal deployment of resources targeted to Indian country in a convenient place, I think that would go a long way.
Well, thank you. And I want to include Mr. Dropik in this discussion. Mr. Dropik, as you noted in your testimony, Native students often face significant hurdles, educational disparities. Can you describe the impact that limited broadband access has had on exacerbating these disparities, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and how, if allocated appropriately, the broadband funding in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the IIJA, can help reduce these disparities.
Yeah, Miigwech, thank you for that opportunity. And you're absolutely correct. So with about 68% of our tribal communities being in rural settings, I can speak firsthand from when we had to pivot to remote learning within our own school. We had students that had moved back to their tribal communities because that's where they had families that could take care of them. So they're out of their city centers with their parents and then went with an aunt or an uncle or a grandparent. And there was zero cell phone signal, let alone broadband access. So we couldn't even give them a hotspot that they could use. And so infrastructure parts of it in terms of increasing access in rural communities. And we know that in the Southwest, the distance and the geographical challenges that exist there for making sure that people have adequate access. What that does is just, there was already a gap. We've seen gap in communities where that isn't an issue, where they are able to access online, whether it's our suburban community or urban centers. And then also what we did though, see in our tribal community, so that gap further spread as students that didn't have those same issues were able to engage in some connections with other people with meaningful learning experiences that were met. So it's that communication, we got to let them know. But even if they knew, some of our families wouldn't have been able to access that because there's just zero capability in their community. And it's because there has been no investment dollars. If I need a classroom or if I have an opportunity to get some high-speed internet, I need a classroom renovation so I don't have a ceiling tile falling on my head. And so those are priorities. You know, when we make those priorities and we cut funds and infrastructure, other resources, it takes away from other opportunities to grow and to create that access. So I think to President Sharp's point, that collaboration about really researching what is it, where do we need to have those priorities made so that we can make sure that they have access, then we can start getting the tools in people's hands and the communication can go out. So that infrastructure part, getting into rural communities is huge, or tribal communities, which is where many of the lands are, is something that has to be addressed as well.
Well, that's well said, and thank you both for your testimony. And Chair Pingree, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think we might have a couple of members who want to ask second questions. I'll try one more time. If Mr. Amadei wants to ask a question, just let me know. Otherwise, I will go back and we'll go with a couple more questions. And I'll start with myself. I wanted to ask Ms. Tetnowski, in your testimony, I thought it was interesting that there are only 2 urban Indian health facilities for the entire East Coast. Is that because of lack of funding, or are there other urban facilities provided or interested in providing health services, but that are not able to do so because of the funding? And what would be the process or what's needed to expand Indian healthcare on the East Coast?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, it does have to do with our ability to get additional funding to increase our service areas. Many of our existing programs were created many years ago, most of which are 40 plus years old as far as organization goes. And so with a 1% line item out of the entire IHS budget, the ability for us to expand into new areas or to create new facilities in new locations is just not possible. We just don't have the bandwidth or the resources to be able to sustain them. One thing I wanted to follow up on what Representative Simpson said about the ability to have advanced appropriations versus mandatory funding. Advanced appropriations would ensure that we weren't shut down during any type of government closure. IHS is currently the only healthcare organization in the federal government that does not have advanced appropriations at this time, again, leading to our inability to expand programs and plan, like President Sharp shared earlier. Planning is critical for those services to expand.
Yeah, thank you for that answer and for your thoughts on the mandatory and advanced funding. Mr. Smith, I want to ask a question of you. In the fiscal year 2022 budget, the Indians Health Service for the first time identified at over $50 million the service pays to the Department of Health and Human Services for assessments Subcommittee urged IHS to fund these costs from the direct operations line rather than hospitals and healthcare, which is used to provide actual service. Has the service consulted with the tribes about moving these costs, and does NIHB have a position on where these costs should be funded?
Thank you for that question. As it's going, I would have to refer back to my technical support to get you the proper answer for what you need. But on another note, when we're talking about advanced appropriations and mandatory, advanced appropriations would give us the stopgap till we can decide and talk together and work together on the mandatory appropriations, so we'd know the full cost of everything that's doing. So like was stated before, we already suffered when the government shut down. And when you talk about people leaving the jobs, we had health persons leaving our Indian Health Services jobs because they weren't getting paid and going over to the paid section and trying not to get qualified health care workers back into our system. So advanced appropriations would be the solution to figuring out what a mandatory would be, because just saying a mandatory appropriations, we don't know what that would be. But if we had just like the VA, it kept going during the shutdown, but the Indian Health Service, and we suffered dearly. So I'll get back to you with your first question, but that
Great, that's fine. You can let us know, and thank you for that. I know those of us in government like to think we're never going to shut down again, but it does seem to happen. So I understand your concerns. One last question, Ms. Sharp. In your written testimony, you propose investments in an economic development pilot program. Could you give me some more details on how the program would work and how it would differ from BIA's existing economic development programs?
Yes, one of the central points of distinction, we know and recognize that healthy tribal economic systems and economy is so much more than tribally owned business. It's attracting companies to locate within Indian country. It's also supporting a private sector economy, our individual tribal citizens. So what we're after is a comprehensive economic development strategy for Indian country that not only assists us in increasing profits, not necessarily governmental revenues. That's a system of taxation, and that's a whole nother area where Congress needs to support our ability to raise revenues. But in the profit sector, tribal nations can compete. We can support intertribal trade. We can gain access to international commerce and trade. We can also build a private sector economy. And so we have to look at economic development within Indian country through that comprehensive lens to know and understand we are a sovereign tribal nation. We could attract companies, we could tax them, we could raise revenues, and we can also create strategies to increase our profitability through commercial ventures and enterprises. That's what we're after.
Great, thank you. That's a really helpful explanation. Mr. Joyce, would you like to ask some further questions?
No, all my questions were addressed by the relevant questions asked by other members, and certainly appreciate you thinking of me, ma'am.
Great. Well, our colleagues have asked some good questions. How about you, Mr. Simpson? Any more questions from you?
Yeah, Chairwoman, I appreciate it. It's not really a question. I'm certain that when this is all over, I'm going to have some staff member, Darren, I'm talking to you, come over to my office and explain to me where I'm wrong or whatever on this. But the question of advanced and mandatory, I still find that fascinating, because you know that if it goes to mandatory spending, it is completely out of our hands then. Just like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, we don't appropriate money for any of those things. Once it goes to mandatory, it's mandatory. And that means that, as an example with Social Security, if you get Social Security check, you will get that check regardless of whether the federal government has any money or not. If we have to borrow the money, you qualify for that, as long as you qualify for that. That's what mandatory spending means. And when you say advanced appropriation, I'm sitting here going, advanced appropriation of what? If it's out of our hands, what are we advancing the appropriation for if it is mandatory spending? So we need to work this out so that we're all on the same page, because I'm on your side on what you're trying to do here. We certainly need to get the Indian Health Services where Indians are receiving the same type of medical care that other Americans are. And I think that's something that this committee has been working on, but it is a huge task, as you know. So let's work together, see if we can solve this. And also, I'm very interested in, having come from a city council where a town of 10,000, where we had 25 miles away on each side, a city of 50,000. We trained all the police officers for those communities. And now we're seeing the same type of thing happening with tribes, where they're training the educators and everything else, and then they're going to where they can get better pay. And we need to solve that problem, frankly. So I appreciate all the work that you all do, and for being here to testify before this committee today. We want to work with you to make sure we get to a good place where we ought to be. Thank you, Chairwoman. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Simpson. I really appreciate your points, and I think we've got some sorting out to do on those questions, and appreciate your insights. And to all of our witnesses today, thank you so much. You've been really helpful to the committee and thinking about what we need to be doing in FY23. And we'll look forward to staying in touch as we work through this process. And again, thank you for your work for your organizations and for providing your insights to us. So with that, I will call this committee adjourned.